pleasure to introduce your panelists for today's EMV panel. At the far end is Steve Braceland, the President and CEO of STJ Retail. Next to Steve is Nick Holland, the Retail Payments Practice Lead for Javelin Strategy and Research. And closest to me is Dee O'Malley, Senior Director of Financial Services for Best Buy Company Incorporated. And as you heard, I'm Catherine Johnson. Our association is Stakeholder Association Driving the Evolution of Payment and Digital Identity. This is a special panel because our three panelists have seen all aspects of payment and EMV. We're going to very quickly get to Q&A, but first I'd like to acknowledge that there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of EMV-related panels and presentations given in the U.S. over the last 3 years. So while the four of us were preparing for this session, we looked at the subject from the viewpoint of being just 259 business days away from liability shift. And that's if you're planning on working on all of the stat holidays. So I'm going to ask our panel some questions, but between each one of those questions, I'm going to turn it over to you because you are the stakeholders who are dealing with that timeline, and your questions are the ones that we're the most interested in answering. So panel, here's my first question, but it does have two parts to it. On a roadmap that takes us to October 2015, how far along should merchants, issuers, and acquirers be at this point? And the second part of that question, if they're behind, where can they go for help? Who'd like to start?
I'll start because nobody's volunteering super quickly. By the way, super excited to be here in this day full of fun, mobile, futuristic activities, and we're going to talk about a 20-year-old technology up here. So it should lighten the room a little bit.
But it is replacing a 50-year-old technology.
This is true. We are moving for light years. So I will give it from a merchant standpoint, and I'm really looking forward to the issuer commentary further down the table. Acquirers, I think they're supposed to be done. They were the ones that had a mandate. I'm assuming the networks got after them if they missed their mandate, and they're working really, really hard. Debit brought a little bit of a conundrum to the whole thing in trying to create specs to get out to their merchants and things along those lines. From a merchant standpoint, if you're not just thinking really hard about it, but have your requirements done, starting your work, starting your programming, have your pin pad selection, all of the things that go along with that, you will not be hitting the date. It is, so I found out today, 259 days away. And it's going to be a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of big work, and it's not, the thing that makes it challenging for retailers is that it's not just about what we're doing, but there are people that we're relying on in the ecosystem from a certification standpoint. Acquirers get heavily involved. So you're a little bit beholden to the broader ecosystem, and unless everything magically goes perfect the first time, which every now and again can happen, I think it's going to be very pressured in the time that's left.
Nick?
So one of the things that Javelin's done is we've actually modeled what's going to happen from a merchant and retailer and issuer perspective over the next couple of years, and it's not going to be anything like we've seen in other countries like the UK or Canada or wherever. All of those had in common a very coherent, well-managed, centralized campaign that was going to push the adoption and educate both consumers and merchants. I was at an EMV migration forum 2 weeks ago, in fact, not far from here, and the conversation was mostly about, well, who owns the education component? And nobody was kind of fessing up, really. So we are less than a year away. Nothing's being done to educate consumers. No one's really owning the merchant education. We've done a fairly extensive survey looking at small to micro merchants that represent 58% of all retailers. Over half of them don't even know what EMV is, or didn't as of October, November last year. So clearly that's probably changed post-Target. But we're in a really bad situation, really, if you've got to have this compliance by October next year. And we're modeling it's going to be about 3 years out by the time there's any proper ubiquity for EMV in the US, given the current state of play. B of A announced last week they are putting out debit cards. Well, that's the first major issue to start putting out debit cards. So that the US is, I would say, woefully unprepared for next year in most respects. There's some aspirational figures of 575 million cards in the market by the end of next year. I think that's kind of a work of science fiction, to be honest. It's probably a couple of 100,000 less than that. So is the US prepared? No, not at all.
Is there anywhere that people can go for help?
People as in which constituency would you?
Take your pick.
Okay. I guess if consumers had any interest or even knew about it, they could go to their issuer who might tell them about it. But and again, from a merchant perspective, there are various alliances out there. But from a coherent branding and communication standpoint, it's the ball has been dropped. It might be a little late to say they're dropping it. It's been dropped.
Steve?
So we're sort of like the retailer's IT shop, I guess. And you asked, where should we be at this point? If I was a retailer and I was thinking strategically, I'd want to be running pilots for this season coming up to see how well they do.
Sorry,
Strategically.
I was going to say, because I'm going to interject a little bit here. That would be great if we would have had the specs to be able to prepare
Exactly.
and be ready.
Right. Oh, totally agree. There's challenges and there's issues all over the place.
Not to beat up the
Brutal.
choir over here.
I'm not the choir.
No choir.
Oh. So, minimum, you're looking at 12 months from start to finish. Other retailers, depending on the route you take, it could take them 24 months. So, those ones are out. They won't be ready till 2017.
And I'd add as well that from a card perspective, they're looking at typically, so there's a lot of, obviously there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of card shipments going out, but card shipments do not mean cards in the market. And we're looking at most models for rolling out the cards, look at a 3-year window for a typical issuer, for replacing their portfolio. So you'll get a real compounding around about 2017, but until then, it's really, it's going to be a long time before you're seeing that real ubiquity on both the cards and the terminal side for EMV. And that has some implications as well, obviously, for things like contactless and NFC. But, I mean, the good news being that there is clearly that snowballing happening. And, that will, I guess, eventually tip the balance for the mobile payment side of things. But, again, I mean, adding to that, there aren't any issuers I'm aware of that are putting out any contactless cards at this point. So we'll see what happens. And again, maybe from a retailer perspective, because of the level of friction you're going to see at the point of sale with contact EMV cards overall, even irrespective of whether that's signature or PIN, but the fact you have to put it into a reader and it slows down, I think on average, or best case scenario, it takes about 4 to 8 seconds additionally in terms of the overall transaction.
Really?
Yeah. According to Walmart.
So I will certainly share, Nick,
Our retailers are
your
quick.
belief that a trial on pilots goes a long way. We saw it in Canada, where we uncovered things that we never suspected would happen, even though we were far from being at the front of the EMV train. The fact that you're going to do something in the US that has never been done anywhere in the world with PIN debit and routing suggests to me that unless you have a pilot where that information can be shared with all of the stakeholders is really risky. So, audience, is there anything you would like to ask any of these panelists related to being ready for 2015, or the comments that you've heard that says that you may not be ready until 2018? Yes, sir.
Not a general question for Best Buy. I know there's a lot of discussion to pin or not to pin. I was wondering which way you guys were leaning.
So I would say that it's a little bit crazy that the ecosystem is going through this massive infrastructure change, because it is. It's massive, and we're leaving a door open. I 100% get the challenges to PIN. The rest of, so much of the rest of the world has gone there, And I just think it leaves open a door and an opportunity for fraud to still occur where we could shut that door. I also don't think every transaction needs PIN, though. We have many, many transactions today that are not authenticated at all. We could argue whether signature is even on authentication. So I don't think somebody should have to go to McDonald's and buy a hamburger and enter a PIN by any means whatsoever. I think for the appropriate rule set, it should be PIN required after that.
Can I add to that a second, Mitch? So I think, we just done like a big study around what's happened in Australia and how they were a signature country, and very recently, in fact, August, they migrated to PIN only. And again, it was kind of, there's a double-edged sword to it. I think pushing PIN was, again, problematic maybe in terms of some of the channels it would push into. Again, there's concerns in the US about ATM fraud, for example. I mean, the way things are staggered, it might, trip into ATM. In the UK, where PIN was introduced with chip and PIN, there was a lot of mail intercept and mail fraud happening. So again, you've got to be careful in terms of how you put PIN in place. But again, I think ultimately the push should be beyond, PIN for certain thresholds of transactions, and then anything below a certain ceiling, maybe say $50, could be just chip or ideally contactless, where you're just tapping it, and that again opens up the window for the mobile commerce.
Yeah, and I think people argue that that's not the best authentication method either because it's static data. And I think we will get to a place where static data isn't required, but for the masses today, that is the best authentication that we have. So does it solve us into the future? Gosh, I hope not. I hope we're looking well beyond that going forward, but it is the best that we have today.
If you look at store operations and the way it works, as you're checking out, today you swipe the card, you hand the card over, they swipe it, and then they hand you a piece of paper. You got to sign it and everything else. No, chip and pin, you insert, you put the pin in, you're out of here. It's very quick that way. I don't even know why signature is even being brought up, and I think the reason is the infrastructure isn't there to handle it.
Yeah, absolutely. Every business has to make their own decision whether this is the right thing to do or not. I'm going to make the grandiose assumption you've all been in a Best Buy store. The fraudsters like our products. It's somewhat of an oxymoron to call it an ROI because we're spending a lot of money to just be where we are today. But it's a really big stick that's coming our way if we miss that October 2015 deadline. I think there are verticals that can think about it a little bit differently. I do believe over time they're going to have to go there because consumers are going to start to expect it. I remember having a conversation with Tim Hortons up in Canada, and they're like, well, we had to do EMV. No payback for us, but consumers start seeing their EMV cards being used, and they just expect that, and we'll get there.
I'm surprised that hasn't actually been done yet. Again, a year out and given Target and the clear paranoia from consumers as a result of that, it seems to have died down a little bit because the flack that Home Depot's getting doesn't seem to be anything near as bad as Target had. But maybe I think Target was a lot to do with timing, obviously, the holiday season and all that. But my point being, I think that you've got lost my train of thought a second. You've got this situation where you've got the merchants are moving along with this quite quickly. That the larger merchants are prepared. They are kind of forewarned and forearmed, and they're moving forward with this. But the consumer isn't really being educated. And I think again that consumer expectation that my issuing bank and my retailer is providing me the tools to protect myself isn't being made apparent. So again, I think that's going to be one area of bringing this forward. I'll be interested to see. We're doing a survey in a couple of months' time of small to mid-tier merchants, looking at again. We asked them last year about their readiness for EMV, and in fact some of the results are available in a white paper over there. Slightly sort of self-serving introduction there, but there is certainly this year we're looking at what are you thinking about, or would you be interested in say Apple Pay / Softcard / Google Wallet if that would if that is bundled in with your EMV solution? Because I think there's actually a disconnect. I don't think a lot of retailers, if they don't know about EMV. And the fact that if you're buying an Ingenico or Verifone terminal, it will already have effectively the capabilities from a hardware standpoint to accept Apple Pay. I don't think they're connecting the dots, so I'd like to know what that disconnect is, and certainly I think Apple Pay could tip the balance further forward with that.
So Dee, on that basis, what are the biggest challenges facing merchants? And where are there gaps where the other stakeholders should be stepping forward, such as the one that Nick has identified about consumer education?
Yeah, I get the feeling we're gonna beat a dead horse here by the time our thing is over. 'Cause I-
Educate the consumers? Yeah,
It's
well,
crazy.
really.
That probably is going to be the number one issue. And I was at Walmart the other day, self-checkout, swipe my card, didn't take it. I'm like, well, what's the deal? I swiped my card, didn't take it. It took me 4 times, and I should know better, right? 4 times I swiped my card before I was like, oh, I have a chip card. Because of course it's been in my wallet a while, but the issuer didn't tell me anything about it. I wouldn't have known what to do. And so, yes, it took me 4 times before I went, oh, I think I need to do something different. What is that going to take my father,
Right.
my brother? It will be interesting. So right now, Walmart, God bless them, they are educating. And they're educating to the detriment of themselves because that's friction at their point of sale. I would love to see, my husband and son are way into football. I have seen $100 million worth of Visa checkout commercials in the last few weeks. I would love to see $100 million worth of EMV education commercials. It'll be interesting to see if that ever comes to fruition.
Will.
We sell iPads. It's really big. It's 6 basis points on average. Pretty sure McDonald's doesn't have 6 basis points. Pretty sure the grocery stores don't have 6 basis points. So there are merchants that make up for that 6 basis
Your
points.
risk exposure is somewhat higher, I would imagine.
It's debilitating to the future of Best Buy big.
There's a couple of retailers in Canada that, small ticket items, convenience stores or something like that, going to get a chocolate bar, we're not going to do EMV. Whereas you get other retailers with big ticket items, furniture stores and so on. I was just with a furniture chain down here a couple of weeks ago, finishing up, their plan, where to go. And, they have big ticket items. So somebody comes in, buys a whole couch set and everything, there goes a few $1,000s easily. Or a TV or an appliance set or whatever. And that's big ticket. So those are the ones that are going to get targeted big time.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, because
You
even
know.
if you're selling small goods in vast numbers and you don't have the right systems and checks and balances in place and you're hacked, then that's a problem. It's not, again, there was obviously counterfeit card fraud, but I guess it gets to the point of what does EMV solve for is the other question, right? But which is bigger. But I mean, certainly, I don't think any CEO of a regional or national chain of retailers selling whatever wants to be on CNN having to explain how they got hacked.
Yeah, and it does, because we're kind of mixing 2 topics. EMV securitizes the card, all sorts of other stuff assists in the hack perspective. But it's somebody mentioned it earlier, we're dealing in an inherently unsecure environment today. And we do, at point of sale, we probably do more than the vast majority of merchants out there. We do CVC2, we key in the last 4 digits of the card, we read both track data, does it match, all sorts of things to minimize what's in there. But they're good at making cards, and it's a perfect transaction at point of sale from our perspective.
Well, you'd also be surprised at the number of retailers, I mean, we're not talking about offline bricks and mortar retailers, but online retailers that don't check for CV2, right? I mean, it's shocking. Because again, it's all about streamlining the process, getting to the
Right.
checkout as fast as possible.
Well, you've got to design systems and solutions that compensate for those things. It's not really up to a retailer, oh, does this signature look the same? Or check the back of the card. They don't have the time to do that. I mean, they're running. They got 20 people in line. People are getting teed off. Next thing you know, they're just going to leave their basket there and walk out the store.
But then
Right?
but
So
you've got to-
checkout's very important to them.
But again, with that in mind, you've got to run. I mean, the real threat of cart abandonment in the physical world, if somebody, is in line and it's now taking every 4th customer has to be retrained, again, flogging that dead horse. But if every customer needs to be told that they put the card in this way, and irrespective of whether they put in a pin or sign or whatever, it's a very different way of transacting. Some of the new terminals actually hold the card in there. So, do you, horror stories already of people trying to yank the card out and breaking the terminal. You know, it's like, just tell people what's going on. It just seems just ridiculous that a year out, nothing's being done. And clearly, I mean, again, sort of fly on the wall from the recent EMV migration forum is none of the stakeholders are really owning this. So, you know, and the fact of it being actually the retailers are probably going to be hit the most in terms of the actual transaction times and obviously, you know, the investment you've had to put in, whether you want it or not. And the fact being, again, that it doesn't do anything, whether you put EMV in or not, card not present fraud is going to keep growing. So, you know.
There are two other factors with fraud that people traditionally don't talk about. And I remember a major oil company coming to us and saying, we don't really have much payment fraud. And we said, no, but right now you don't have someone standing just off-site your lots selling counterfeit cards for $10 that are going to allow that buyer to fuel up with a full tank, and you're going to get hit with the chargeback. And they thought about that for a while, and they went, yeah, okay, we're converting to EMV just to get around that problem. But the other issue that no one ever addresses is that if you look at every other country that's already gone, and Nick certainly would have seen these figures, whatever your domestic fraud goes down by, your international fraud goes up at least that high, if not higher. And all of that fraud is happening here in the US. So my mag stripe, or my chip cards with the mag stripe on the back have been replaced several times. Never because there's been a problem with the chip, but the mag stripe has been skimmed and the card has been used here in the US. And it's a double whammy for the issuers. They have to replace my card, which is not cheap, and they've got to eat the fraud. So at some point, the rest of the world is going to say, if that kind of fraud can continue to happen in the US, they need to be compensated for it. That's not going to be a comfortable discussion for any of the participants.
I think it's probably safe to assume some of those very uncomfortable discussions have already occurred.
Can I add to that? I mean, again, I brought up so we published a paper earlier in the year around EMV and so on. And one of the things that we posed is where the industry needs to go next is actually have that conversation about let's just get rid of the mag stripe, probably, you know, let's at least have that conversation very soon, because you're going to have this holdout in certain regions and with certain tiers of retailers, because, you know, they can still use mag stripe cards, they don't have to upgrade the EMV reader because their fraud exposure is very small if you're a mom and pop store or whatever. But fundamentally, I think there will be a tipping point maybe when we get to maybe 80% of EMV card penetration and terminal penetration, when it is viable to say, look, the rest of you need to get your act together, and why have we got this 50-year-old loophole on the back of cards that are 20 years old, but better than, you know, it's you know, the fact that you can counterfeit mag stripes with the ease you can. It's just time to just shut the door on that. It's just ludicrous that the industry isn't publicly having that conversation now. I mean, certainly there's pressure in the rest of the world on the US to fix that, because as you rightly allude, it just goes elsewhere.
Well,
So
some of the other countries are discontinuing their cards,
they have,
right?
I mean, there have been
So-
conversations about that. Yeah.
Right, so if you have let's say you're in Canada in 2015, in October, our debit cards, if you're a Canadian, you have a Canadian debit card. If you don't use the chip, you won't be able to fall back to mag stripe.
At the point of sale, and we're already there for ATMs. That happened a
Right.
couple of years ago.
So, but the only reason we have the mag stripe on the back is if we want to shop outside the country.
So, I mean,
Right.
that's a great example. With Interac, when they did that, this year they posted that their fraud has been reduced by, what was it, over 70% on counterfeit? And all but 7 million of that was perpetrated here in the US.
Yep.
Because they had shut that door down in terms of domestic fraud at
And again,
ATMs.
So
I mean,
7 million, if we multiply that by 10 for the US, it should be 70 million down here. Is it close to that?
what the clearly.
So we had a number of questions, but you've been asking great questions, and I'm going to ask the panel a question that they didn't anticipate. It came from my listening to a lot of different conversations over the past 2 days. And I'm going to start with D because I want to hear this first from a merchant viewpoint. Currently, you have an honor all card stipulation in your merchant agreement. Do you think that this is going to lead to an honor all interfaces and form factors? And if that is the case, what problems does that introduce for you as a merchant?
So I won't
Is that a loaded question?
speculate the future, although there are some mandates going on in Europe in regards to contactless. I think the tea leaves can be read in how merchants feel about the potential of that through some of the very strong opposition to settlements that are going on and various MDLs that are out there. I think that's probably one of the larger topics of concern. And it's interesting throughout the day today, it's just payments. Payments don't matter. Well, they actually really do matter. They don't matter as much as ensuring that the customer is taken care of and we meet their needs. Absolutely, we have to do that. Merchants are starting to, we have a history of selling stuff, right? For years and years and years, payments was just the check you wrote at the end of the month. And it's just the bill you paid. You didn't really think about it. That's not what we focus on as merchants. We focus on selling things. Well, as there's been consolidation, as fee structures have gotten more complex, as fees have gone up because clearly they don't go down, merchants are starting to care about this. And it's not just the cost, it's the rules that go along with it. So a lot of conversation today about card present and card not present. Years ago, we took up this rule set of card present, magstripe transactions, plunked it into the world of e-commerce, and it solved some things, right, that we can purchase online, created a whole new space for consumer interaction. We feel some pretty significant pain associated with this rule set that was not made at all for e-commerce and the fact that it moved over. So now merchants are seeing the next transition, and that's into the world of mobile. And there's pretty significant concern about, once again, picking up this rule set that was made for a very specific use case and moving it into the mobile phone. And I think that's why you don't necessarily see people rushing out and making investments in the unknown, because they are unknown. I mean, there has been NFC out there for a really, really long time. We did have it at one point, and I think 1 month we maybe hit 0.2% of transactions in the most popular store. So we're just not ahead of our consumers on it. We will be there for them when they are ready to do that. But that is a concern. It's picking up things and putting it in a space where it's maybe not the best served.
Nick?
I'll go, yeah. I mean, clearly there are issues, or there will be issues when the device, I mean, we've grown up with plastic cards, and the card itself is a form of authentication. You trust it, you trust the hologram and so on, and you know, that is issued from a bank. It takes a lot of money to counterfeit them to a degree that is real, right? I mean, it's clearly counterfeiting goes on. So I think there's going to be a lot of problems with mobile devices in that just the pure number of SKUs in the market and which ones are genuine and which ones aren't. So I think that the ability for a phone or a watch or whatever to be your payment vehicle brings up some issues. But I mean, on the flip side, I mean, clearly the kinds of authentication you can manage with these devices can be way more robust than anything out there. And clearly, a signature is redundant as a form of authentication. PIN is, obviously, again, it's a static factor of authentication. The argument that your biometric fingerprint or iris scan or whatever is weaker than PIN is clearly null and void. So again, it's there's different ways this can work. But again, I think the device becomes almost irrelevant when it's authenticating you rather than the form factor. So I think there will be issues as we transition, but I think it will be quite easily resolved from a technical standpoint. Does that answer the question, or some of it?
It
All right.
does. Thank you.
The only thing I'll comment is that the merchants really need to look at their systems and their architectures and almost re-engineer their whole payments. They need to look at it from that perspective. it is a fundamental architecture change. And if they do it right, some retailers did it the hard way and probably paid about 4 or 6 times what other retailers paid to get the same thing. So there's good ways to do it and there's bad ways to do it.
I think that is a positive that's coming out of this whole EMV transition, is that it's not often that we as merchants really open up the hood that deeply when it comes to our point of sale and point of sale transactions. And all of us are looking at every aspect, whether it's not just contact and contactless, but is that when you put in end-to-end, do you pull your payments architecture completely out and make it in its own little space so that it's easy to add tender types down the road? And because we are, especially brick and mortar merchants, we are residing in systems that have been around a long time. And it's provides an opportunity to just streamline for a still large but lesser investment probably, because we're already there and under the hood.
I couldn't agree more. I think with EMV and everything that's happening around contactless and mobile, we have this golden window of the next few years to re-educate, and I'm going to obviously beat this, flog this horse to death here, but,
Because I don't think it's going to die quite yet.
No, but I really think that, again, we have this window of opportunity, and so if we're going to move to new form factors and, encourage new means for people to authenticate themselves and to pay and so on, then, it's this window we have now when people will be moving away from habitual behaviors around swiping a card or paying with cash or writing checks or whatever. So we have this time when we can actually re-educate. And yes, it's going to be burdensome for a while, and it's incumbent that we do it cleanly and efficiently. But it is, the times are changing here, and really, the input of mobile now and the training that is done quickly and as like I say, painlessly as possible. I was going to say painfully as possible. Will be very beneficial. It's clearly that's one of the biggest sticking points. An example being, and this kind of came up with the previous panel. You can have these really efficient payment systems, and it's kind of an Uber-like experience. But if you don't train the staff as to what's going on, they think I'm shoplifting. I actually had this experience a few years ago, and I had I was one of the early Google Wallet phones I was playing with, and I went into a 7-Eleven which was compliant with Google Wallet, and they thought I was hacking the payment terminal. So it's clearly it's incumbent that everyone in the ecosystem is brought up to speed with what's happening, and that goes all the way down to the baristas, the clerks, everybody. The problem being, again, of course, that if you are a member of the McDonald's staff, then the likelihood of you having a long tenure there is probably not that likely. So and other QSR environments and so on. But it is clearly that pushing of the education downstream to the end users on both the merchant and the consumer side will be absolutely critical.
One of the things I hear out there a lot is there's an assumption being made out in the industry is that as we move to EMV, it's this great moment of reterminalization, which it is. No doubt about it. People are going to have to reterminalize. I don't think that it's necessarily a safe assumption that all factions of that terminal will work. So I think about our roadmap and our 259 days and counting. I'm working for contact. That gives me my protection from a liability shift standpoint. If I try to overlay contactless on that and it pushes me out past that liability shift date, it's not going to happen at this time. Will it happen down the road? It very well might. But there's a lot of work to squeeze in. We've already kind of conceded that, gosh, there's not many people that are probably going to be ready. I think the largest merchants are. One, because we're a little more sophisticated and have thought about it. And two, we can worm our way into getting resources a little bit better probably than some others. But once you go below that, they're going to have to catch up.
Very long tail of small merchants.
Yes, yes.
So the merchants that are international, Whole Foods, Toys R Us, Best Buy, Walmart, and so on, they have some expertise and experience, and they've been there and done this. So just doing a U.S. version of it, yes, it's more complex, and there's other things, but you have some experience and knowledge and knows what it takes to go through that process. In other words, it's not just adding a payment key on the keyboard. It's a little bit more complex than that.
There's some nuances to the U.S. market that are, clearly very different from the rest of the world. It's always been online transactions. It's always been, the issues that happened in, a decade ago in the UK because of batch processing aren't an issue here. It's just not, it's kind of a moot point. So we've always had that, this idea that fraud's going to migrate, overseas. Well, where are they going to go now? Papua New Guinea, it's really, the window of opportunity there is somewhat diminished. But, so that the US is going to have its own unique issues and, but I think also opportunities as well.
Well, you're going to have a real problem with consumers at the point of sale who are used to swiping their card and then putting it back in their wallet. And
Yeah.
that change now of having to insert your card and leave it there until the transaction is completed, that's a major difference that we haven't seen anywhere in the world. And it comes back to that consumer education. Who's going to train them on that? It might be the prompts on the terminal, and I say it might, because one of the biggest problems we saw with consumer experience in Canada was that every acquirer used different prompts. And some of them made assumptions that because we used PIN in Canada with debit, that we would inherently know to do certain things. So they just didn't put them in the prompts. Our problem was the minute you inserted a card, rather than hand it to a cashier to swipe it, the brain kicked in and said, whoa, this is different. Maybe I better follow these prompts. And if the prompt was incomplete, the transaction timed out, leaving a problem for the merchant with the lineup, and the issuer who now had to replace a card because the cashier said, those cards don't work.
Yeah, I mean, we are so going to feel it. And I don't know if Bill's still in the room, but I think I feel for Target more than just about anybody, because I am swiped, signed, ready to go by the time they are working their way with their second product over the scanner. So you think about that interaction where the card is now going to have to sit there for a really long time. And prompts do help. I think I got in trouble probably at Walmart the next time I went, because I'm like, okay, I'm going to be purposeful about this and taking pictures of their prompts at point of sale, and I have them on my phone right here. And so we'll continue to educate, but when there is friction, they're not going to be mad at the issuer. They're certainly not going to be mad at the network. It's going to be us that feels that, and the other players in the system need to help us
Although
out.
having said that, I mean, again, a few years ago when I was working for a previous payments retail research house, we did some work around what was happening with US consumers going outside of the country and using, their card. And any time there was a bad experience, they tended to punish that card. It went to the bottom of the wallet. So it's not necessarily just an issue for the retailers. If you don't kind of, again, from an issuer standpoint, educate the consumer, they might end up punishing your card. I mean, again, they associate it with a bad experience, and there is a hangover effect that will continue. So, it's not just going to be a retailer problem by a long shot.
Yeah, I think the good news is, we're kind of smart people. We'll figure it out pretty quickly. The little things we think about is, gosh, where are we going to store the cards when consumers walk out of the store and leave them in the terminal, because that's happened everywhere else. My guess is somebody will leave their card behind in a terminal once, and they will forever be trained on how to utilize an EMV transaction. Hopefully it's not at Best Buy.
So we're going to take one last question, and then I'm going to wrap up. So I was asked to repeat the question for the camera, and so I'm just going to do the question part of it. As a merchant, what do you think of tokenization on a mobile device to help you deal with fraud?
Tokenization is clearly a place that we need to go. We will go. We actually were a very early adopter of tokenization. Layering on a Visa MasterCard tokenization spec over our own tokenization brings some complications. For the general card that comes into our store, don't know if those are static tokens, dynamic tokens. If they're dynamic tokens, you can get into a whole conversation around CRM and how does that impact our ability to know them across channel, and so there are some complications there. I think there's also some complications as it relates to our branded payments products. So we have offers to those consumers from a financing standpoint, from a loyalty standpoint that are attached to that card product. If it is tokenized, and again, depending on whose token spec, if our MasterCard was in the Apple Pay product and it came into our stores and we took that, how would I know that it's our product? So I'll assume I can get over that hurdle. can MasterCard take a financing plan and put that through their system? In all honesty, I don't know. But I think there's this halo to deal with for the vast majority of, yes, just gonna use them transactions, arguably should take it out of PCI scope. It's got a lot of benefit. I think there is a lot of halo that the merchants will feel that hasn't really been talked about in great detail. For the most part, we don't sit at that table. Those things are solved in a manner that the rest of the ecosystem thinks is best for us.
I'd agree. I mean, again, tokenization is, again, I think seen as, I mean, it's critical, but it does have this, I guess, aura of being a silver bullet in the same way as EMV does at the moment. And it's talked about as if it's a simple thing to just drop in place, when it doesn't take into account all of the minutiae of actually running a retail business that, you know, are complex. So I trust the industry will work it out, but again, it's like I say, it's not a quick fix.
So unfortunately, we've run out of time, although I assure you have not run out of questions. There is one thing that I'd like to wrap this up with as we look at EMV and the impact that has on merchants and other stakeholders. And the statement that I hear made more often than any other related to payment these days: we have to accept everything that a consumer wants to use to pay. Well, if that's the case, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to think like a consumer. I want to just give you something and walk out of the store. I don't want a sign. I don't want a pin. I certainly don't want a biometric. That's what consumers want. They want to pay and get out quickly. And all of the things that you're proposing to do don't meet that need. Biometrics, I love biometrics in certain situations, but there are 38 different biometrics. How many of them does that merchant have to have at the point of sale? An iris scanner, a fingerprint reader? I can do 10,000 different templates on the fingers. How much of that software does that person have to have? Retina scanner? I mean, we have to come back to looking at this and say there has to be a business case. There will always be early adopters, but are we really going to change payment every 3 months for early adopters? Or are we going to look at it and say, when are we going to get to the mass market where we can start making money and all of the stakeholders, the acceptors and the issuers and the payment brands and the consumers and law enforcement are well served, and the only stakeholder group in payment that isn't well served is organized crime? If we start thinking of it that way, as technology comes out and makes it possible to do changes, we'll pick the right technologies. And if we talk to each other as stakeholders, and you just heard Dee say, decisions are made at the table about what will be accepted in her stores without her being represented. If we start including all of the stakeholders, we will get robust and secure payment that meets everyone's needs. So thank you very much, and I'm going to pass it back because I know we have lunch coming up.